that bothered them. And there's an interesting analogy in the Quran with Ibrahim or Abraham, where there's all these idols that his people worshipped. And one night he goes in, he was only about 12 or 13, he goes in and he smashes all of the idols except for one of them. And he puts the axe in the big one. And then he leaves and they come back and they find all their idols smashed. So they say, this Ibrahim was talking about this. They go get him and they say, who did this? And he said, ask the big one. And they said, what, do you think we're stupid? He can't say anything. And he said, then why are you worshiping him? And then it's a very interesting verse in the Quran. It says, رَجِعُوا إِلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ. They became self-reflective. Very interesting. They became self-reflective. Suddenly they said, he's got a point here. Now this became troublesome for them, because at that point a window opens and it can close very quickly, and somebody shouted, get rid of him. Right? And then it becomes a mob scene. Yeah, let's not think about this. Let's kill him. Right? Now, there's an interesting German philosopher, Heidegger, who has a theory about what he calls thrownness. That human beings are thrust into a certain environment, and they literally take on all of these qualities, not based on their own individual reality, but based on what everybody else has told them. And so we learn about the them very quickly. And there are certain expectations within the context of them, the other, like that we don't belch in public, right? I mean, we learn quickly that there are certain things we don't breach. And they're not things that we chose, they're things that are imposed on us. And obviously they have purpose and we're civilized people, right? We don't do certain things. But also there's a type of, what Heidegger felt was a type of inauthenticity that went with that, because people really hadn't reflected about who they were in their essence or their essential nature. They were really simply only confirming what had been reflected back to them from their culture and their society. And people that break these models, in England they would be called eccentrics. Right? People that don't, and the English actually kind of allow for that within their culture, but you have to be rich, that's a prerequisite. Because if you're poor, they call you mad. But Heidegger felt that a person who had never come to terms with this, he called it an undifferentiated person. They really had never thought that the only reason I am the way I am is because I grew up in a certain culture and environment. And this culture and environment has completely imposed upon me a way of viewing the world, a language that involves a worldview. All of these things are literally superimposed upon us, and we submit to them without reflection, by and large. Now, Heidegger's solution to it was, he said the only authentic act that you could really do once you realized this was die. In other words, nobody's going to teach you how to die. You will do that very authentically. So he said you become a being unto death. But for the Muslim, and I really think that the Quran really did this to these people, it forced them to look at what Heidegger would call their thrownness. In other words, why are we worshiping these idols? Why are we burying our baby girls alive? People didn't think about it. You see, it's like in certain cultures, I mean, in this culture we have a very serious crisis where there's reflection on both sides with the abortion issue. I mean, there's people who say this is wrong. And we hear that and we have to think about it. Whereas in that culture, nobody was there saying it was wrong. They were saying it was perfectly acceptable. Now here comes a man who starts saying, this is wrong. That's a very strong thing for a people who have not given a lot of reflection to themselves or their cultures. So the Quran begins to literally question things very deeply. And the first period, which is 13 years, is called the Meccan period. Now during the Meccan period, the dominant themes within the Quran are primarily what in Arabic is called Tawheed. Now Tawheed is sometimes translated as monotheism. which is, I don't like that translation. The actual word in Arabic means to make one. If you translated it quite literally, it would be the making of one. But the word means, from a Quranic perspective, is worshiping Allah or God with absolutely no association in that worship. Nothing is associated in that worship with God. Nothing whatsoever. And this is, if you want one word that will give you the theme of Quran, it's this word. And this is why the Muslims have, in the Western comparative religious tradition, they've been called radical monotheists. More so than the Jewish tradition and more so than the Christian tradition. The Muslims are considered radical monotheists. One, there's absolutely no anthropomorphism in Islam. There is no association of God with creation. And probably one of the most definitive verses in the Quran about the nature of Tawheed is لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is no thing like God. The early community said, whatever occurs to your intellect, God is other than that. The companion of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, the Siddiq, the second Khalifa, or the first Khalifa after the Messenger, said, your inability to comprehend God is your comprehension of God. Your inability to comprehend God is your comprehension of God. That is the essence of Tawheed. Now, here's where we get in a problem. We say, if God is unknowable, then how do we know God? Right? Now, it's interesting because within the Christian tradition, the first person to really deal with this issue, I mean, there's probably Tertullian, you might have some inklings of it, but the first person really to deal with this issue is probably Kierkegaard, who's a very interesting philosopher. Because Kierkegaard recognizes suddenly that the knowability of God, there's definitely a problem there. Now, the way the Christians have tended to deal with that is through Christ. Christ becomes the object of God's knowability. That God becomes man so that man can understand God. Right? I mean, this is an element within Christian theology. For the Muslim, the knowability of God is through the creation itself. And this is why much of the Quran is focused on telling people to explore the creation itself. Because the creation is seen as a theater of manifestation, of divine manifestation. That God is not entering in, is not incorporated, is not becoming, He is not becoming, embodying Himself into the creation, like incarnation is becoming the flesh. And likewise, what Montgomery Watt would like to suggest is that somehow God has imbibliated Himself. Nice, fancy PhD word. That God became book, right? Which is not true. The Muslims do not look at that, even though they do believe that the Quran is an attribute of God. That this Quran that we have here, we do not say that this is God's, God on earth or something like that. No. Although we do believe that the Quran is the speech of God, and we believe it's the uncreated speech of God. In the eternal meanings that move into the vehicle of language, the intentions of God. That is the speech of God. So Tawheed is a very important theme. The next idea is the idea of Akhirah. And Akhirah means what comes after. It means the end. The hereafter. The interesting thing about the Arabs is the Arabs did not believe in a hereafter. Many traditions have a hereafter. The Arabs did not believe in a hereafter. They thought, this is it. When you die, it's over. And they said, if we're bones and dust, will we be brought back to life? The Quran says, the one who created you the first time is capable of creating you a second time. In other words, the fact that you've come into existence one time, a second time, even by our own logic, would seem to be easier. Because if you've made something one time, it's generally easier the second time around. Right? So there's the logic behind that. So the Arabs denied this idea of akhirah or the next world. Now the next world in the Quran is quite descriptive. And traditionally the Europeans often had a difficult time with it because there are aspects of it that are quite sensual. Right? The idea of gardens under which rivers flow, of fruits, of maidens and beautiful youth, and these type of things. So this idea of an akhirah is being introduced into the Arabian culture. Now they obviously had they're meeting the Christians and the Jews on their caravan routes, and they're hearing about these things, but they really had an attitude that was basically characterized as disbelief. They did not believe in some other world. They thought this is it, and for them, the world was what they called muru'ah, was virility, manhood, chivalry, poetry, women, wine. This was really the environment of the era, and they praised these qualities and they praised these aspects of the world. And much of their poetry is about wine and women. Right? I mean, this is what they were interested in. Suddenly you have a book that's radically challenging that worldview. Radically challenging it. Very powerful experience for these people that are forced to begin to think about these things. Now, for the first 13 years, the Prophet is persecuted in Mecca. During this time, these people were learning the Quran that was being revealed by memory. The Quran was not revealed linearly, which is important because it's not a linear book. And that's something, if you really want to understand the Quran or be able to read it, you have to surrender your desire for linearity. Right?